Imagine dedicating 30 years of your life, 3 entire decades of grueling work, to a single goal, only to have the most powerful beings in the galaxy laugh in your face. That's what just happened to Elena Vasquez. But what these ancient, all-knowing aliens didn't realize is that they had just made the biggest mistake of their very, very long lives. And you are definitely going to want to stick around to see how she serves them a dish of revenge so cold it's practically frozen solid. After a career fueled by cheap coffee and pure, uncut determination, Elena had finally secured the most important mission in the history of humankind: to formally request a seat at the Galactic Council. At 52 years old, her hair was more salt than pepper, and the lines around her eyes told stories of 1,000 sleepless nights. But her mind? It was sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. Her resolve was like steel, forged in the fire of her belief that humanity deserved a place among the stars. She'd spent the last 6 months in a brutal mental boot camp, cramming the cultures of 412 different alien species into her brain. She didn't just memorize their economic policies and war histories. She lived and breathed them, reciting her opening remarks in her sleep until they were perfect. Humanity had done the work, and Elena was there to collect. Captain David Chen, a man whose calm exterior hid a lion's loyalty, appeared at her doorway. He'd been her right-hand man for the last 15 years. "We're nearing the council station, Ambassador," he said, his voice a steady comfort. "We should be docking in about 2 hours." Elena simply nodded, her focus absolute. "Thank you, Captain. I'm ready." She turned back to the viewport, watching the endless black peppered with stars slide by. Out there was the galactic core, home to a station that had been in orbit for 11,000 years, a silent testament to powers so old they made human history look like a single heartbeat. And today, Elena Vasquez, representing a species they probably saw as toddlers playing with spaceships, was about to walk into their sacred halls and demand a seat at the grown-ups' table. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. The real council station made every holographic rendering she'd studied look like a child's crayon drawing. This wasn't a structure. It was a floating city of crystal, an artificial moon that seemed to be drinking light directly from a nearby star. Thousands of alien ships buzzed around it like bees around a cosmic lily. Next to them, our ship, the Aurora, looked like a rubber duck in the ocean. Let's be honest, our technology was a joke to them. While they were manipulating space-time, we were still celebrating incremental improvements to our rocket engines. Their shields could phase through asteroids. Ours were basically high-tech magnets. We were the new kids on a very old block, just learning to tie our shoes while they were all running intergalactic marathons. But you have to start somewhere. Elena navigated the complex docking protocols like she was born to it, her voice calm and clear, thanks to a tiny piece of tech tucked behind her ear. It was a diplomatic gift from the Minari, one of the first species we'd opened trade with about 40 years ago. A tiny gesture of friendship that was about to prove its weight in gold. The device was a universal translator, allowing her to understand any language spoken and letting everyone else hear her in their own native tongue. But no piece of technology could have prepared her for the sheer scale of the station's interior. The hallways were so massive they could accommodate any life form you could dream up, from sparkling creatures small enough to dance on your fingernail, to behemoths that could have swallowed her starship whole. The very walls seemed alive, pulsing with light that changed colors based on the emotions of the beings walking past. The atmosphere was a perfectly mixed cocktail of gases, allowing dozens of different species to breathe the same air. Her guide was a silent, floating robotic orb that just drifted ahead, leading her through winding corridors, past alien markets overflowing with strange treasures, and through gardens growing impossible plants from 1,000 different worlds. She saw species she'd only ever seen in textbooks, the Vorthani, who resembled giant, floating jellyfish and communicated with shifting light patterns, the Kali, beings of pure energy housed in elegant crystal shells, and the insectoid Zilvari, whose leader, the High Arbiter, held the final word on almost everything. And for every species she recognized, there were 10 more she couldn't even begin to wrap her mind around. She saw beings that looked like they were made of living fire, others that appeared to be carved from moving glaciers, and a few that were so profoundly strange her brain simply refused to process the image. And every single one of them, without exception, stopped and stared as the small, solitary human walked by. Elena kept her head held high, her expression a perfect mask of professional calm. She was the voice of 8 billion people back home. She would not show them an ounce of fear. The grand chamber was something else entirely. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into a swirling, man-made nebula. The walls were lined with thousands upon thousands of seats, tiered all the way up into the artificial sky. All 412 member species were here, a breathtaking tapestry of life in every shape, size, and color imaginable. And there, in the center of it all, on a raised platform, sat the High Council. These were the 5 most powerful beings in the galaxy, representing the oldest and most influential races, the ones who had been writing galactic law for thousands of years. Their decisions were final. In the center seat was High Arbiter Zilvex, a Zilvari who had held his position for over 300 years. His insect-like body was draped in ceremonial metals that shimmered in the ambient light. His huge compound eyes reflected her small figure 1,000 times as she approached the petitioner's podium. The podium was just a simple, plain disc in the exact center of the immense room. Following human tradition for such a momentous occasion, she approached it alone. One woman, standing for an entire world. The moment she stepped onto the platform and stopped, a profound, crushing silence fell over the assembly. Every eye, in every shape and form, was on her. High Arbiter Zilvex's voice echoed through the chamber, translated perfectly by the device behind her ear. The Galactic Council acknowledges the envoy from the planet designated Earth. State your name and your purpose. Elena took a slow, measured breath. My name is Ambassador Elena Vasquez, and I represent the United Earth Confederacy. I stand before this honorable council to formally petition for humanity's inclusion as an associate member of the Galactic Council. A quiet ripple of sound, a collective whisper, moved through the massive crowd. Elena expected it. Asking for associate membership right out of the gate was a bold, almost arrogant move for a species as young as humanity, but she knew they had earned it. The Council has heard Earth's request, Zilvex said. You may make your case. Elena tapped a control on her wrist, and a holographic image of our beautiful, swirling blue home world bloomed in the air. It's true that humanity has only been traveling the stars for 63 years, she began. In that short time, we have built stable colonies on 3 different worlds. We developed faster-than-light travel on our own, we mastered artificial gravity, and our medical technology has increased our average lifespan by 30 years. The hologram shifted, showing humans working alongside other aliens, our ships filled with goods for trade, our diplomats shaking hands, or tentacles or claws, with envoys from a dozen different planets. We have built peaceful and prosperous trade relationships with 47 species. We have made valuable contributions to joint scientific projects in fields from quantum physics to xenobiology. We have shared our art, our music, and our culture with anyone willing to listen, and in return, we have enthusiastically embraced the incredible diversity of our galactic neighbors. The image changed one last time, showing human soldiers fighting beside alien allies to take down pirate fleets. We have also done our part to maintain galactic peace. Human forces have volunteered for 12 separate peacekeeping missions in the last 20 years. We have lost over 1,000 of our people defending worlds and species we had only recently met. Elena let the hologram fade, the silence in the chamber now feeling thick with anticipation. She raised her chin, her eyes scanning the thousands of beings watching her. We are a young race. We know this. We are fully aware we have much to learn and a long way to go, but we believe our youth is our greatest strength, not our greatest weakness. We bring a new perspective to the table, fresh energy, and a way of looking at the universe that could be a benefit to every single person in this room. Her voice gained strength, ringing with passion. Humanity is not here to ask for a handout. We are here to offer a partnership. We want a seat at this table, not because we feel entitled to it, but because we truly believe we have earned the right to make our voice heard." She bowed her head slightly in a universal sign of respect. The United Earth Confederacy formally requests associate membership in the Galactic Council. We offer our friendship, our complete cooperation, and our absolute commitment to peace and prosperity for every species. Elena finished her speech and stood perfectly still. She'd said her piece. Now, it was up to them. The thousands of tiny lenses in the High Arbiter's eyes seemed to dance with light. The Council has acknowledged the petition from Earth. The floor is now open for discussion. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the thumping of a human heart. Then, a deep, vibrating voice boomed from one of the upper tiers. 63 years? It was the delegate from Vorthon, a colossal jellyfish-like being whose body pulsed with a color her translator instantly tagged as pure, smug amusement. These beings have had faster-than-light capability for a mere 63 of their planet's orbits, and they genuinely believe that makes them worthy of joining us. That's when it started. The laughter. It was a horrifying symphony of clicks, whistles, shimmering lights, and weird vibrations, but the meaning was unmistakable. They were laughing at her. They were laughing at all of humanity. Elena felt a flash of white-hot rage, but her expression remained a perfect sheet of ice. Can you even fathom it? Their entire species still measures time by the spin of one little planet. The Vorthani delegate scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. They haven't even adopted the galactic standard calendar like any civilized race would. The laughter swelled. Another voice, this one from the Krail delegate, a being of pure energy in a crystalline shell, chimed in. Aren't these the same organisms who nearly wiped themselves out playing with atomic fission? They split the atom, and the very first thing they built was a bomb. They dropped it on their own cities. The laughter exploded into a deafening roar. They can't even govern themselves, boomed a four-armed creature from the hegemony of 12 stars. Their little rock is split into 193 warring tribes. They haven't even unified their own world. Then a final disgusted shout from the back. They eat the flesh of other living things. Just imagine, your entire species is on trial in front of the galaxy, and they've decided you're nothing more than a cosmic punchline. They called humanity fragile, short-lived creatures who feel pain, waste a third of their lives sleeping, and think getting burned by their own sun is a fun way to pass the time. The Grand Chamber, home to 412 alien species, completely erupted in laughter. If that sounds like the biggest injustice you've ever heard, you'll want to stick around to see how one human's silent response completely changed the future of the galaxy. Standing at that podium, Elena felt those waves of mockery crash over her, and something deep inside her finally snapped. She had come prepared for arguments, for tough negotiations, maybe even for a flat-out rejection. But she hadn't prepared for this. This wasn't a debate. It was raw, unfiltered disgust for everything it meant to be human. Her eyes scanned the ocean of alien faces. A few were silent, their expressions unreadable, but the overwhelming majority were howling like they'd just heard the best joke in a millennium. They looked at her and saw a funny little animal, not an equal. The jeering went on for almost 10 solid minutes before the High Arbiter, Zilvex, finally raised one of his limbs, signaling for quiet. The chamber gradually quieted down, though you could still hear little chuckles and snorts echoing off the walls of the massive hall. The Council appreciates humanity's enthusiasm, Zilvex said, his mandibles clicking together in a sound that resembled a dry, insect-like laugh. It's always so charming when a developing species is this eager to sit at the adult's table. His compound eyes seemed to stare right through her. However, he went on, we have to look at the bigger picture. To be a member of this council requires a certain level of maturity, of unity, and of contribution. Humanity, while spirited, is simply too young, too chaotic, and much, much too primitive. He spread his upper arms in what was probably supposed to be a sympathetic gesture, but it just felt incredibly condescending. Maybe in another 1,000 years, after your species has had some time to grow up, you can try again. For now, we suggest you go back to your little corner of the galaxy and, well, try not to blow yourselves up." His mandibles clicked one last time, setting off a final ripple of laughter across the chamber. And through it all, Elena stood there, perfectly motionless. She let the sound wash over her. In her 30 years as a diplomat, she'd been insulted, ignored, and laughed at more times than she could remember. But never, not once, had it been on this scale. In that instant, something inside her turned to steel. She had walked in here hoping to build a new alliance. She had truly believed that if she could just present her case well enough, they would recognize humanity's potential, that a shared future among the stars was within reach. That hope died right there, drowned in a tidal wave of alien ridicule. As the noise finally started to die down, Elena reached up and ripped the universal translator from behind her ear. The little device wasn't meant to be removed like that. A sharp, burning pain shot through her head, but she didn't so much as blink. She held the small piece of tech in her palm, this tiny symbol of her people's hopes and dreams. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, she set it down on the podium. The room went completely silent. This was not how things were done. No one had ever done this. Elena raised her head and gazed out at the combined power of the galaxy. 412 species, 11,000 years of shared history, the wisdom of 1,000,000 star systems, and not a single one of them saw humanity as anything more than a child. She didn't say a word. What was the point? They'd already made their decision. No powerful speech she could deliver would ever convince them that humans were anything but insignificant primitives. So she gave them nothing but silence. And then, Elena Vasquez turned her back on the Galactic Council. In the huge, silent chamber, the sound of her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the exit. Her back was perfectly straight, her head held high. She never looked back. As the giant doors hissed shut behind her, the laughter in the grand chamber was gone, replaced by a stunned and confused silence. In the entire 11,000-year history of the Council, no species asking for a seat had ever just walked out. They would plead, they would try to make deals, they would get angry, some would even break down and cry, but nobody in all that time had ever just turned around and left. High Arbiter Zilvex felt a strange flicker of doubt. "The petition is denied," he announced, but the usual authority in his voice was missing. "Let's move on." The entire mood in the Great Hall had shifted. The next speaker might as well have been talking to himself. Whispers flew between delegates, their eyes glued to the massive doors where the human ambassador had disappeared. It was confusing. Humanity was a nobody in the galactic community, a new species from some backwater corner of the galaxy. They had no real power, no influence at all. And yet, as the meeting continued, delegate after delegate found their minds wandering back to that silent walk, that defiant posture, and that look of absolute chilling composure. It was deeply unsettling. Aboard her ship, the Aurora, Elena Vasquez sat alone in the quiet of her room. They had left the station the moment she was back on board and were already making the long journey home. The captain had tried to talk to her, but she had just waved him away. She needed a minute to think. The throbbing ache behind her ear was starting to fade, replaced by the much sharper pain of complete failure. All that work, all that hope, it was all for nothing. The Council would never accept them as equals. Not in 1,000 years, not in 10,000. To them, humans were just amusing little creatures, like ants building a funny little hill right before the tide comes in and washes it all away. But as Elena stared out at the sea of stars, that pain slowly began to transform into something else. She was no stranger to failure. Every diplomat knows that failure is just the price you pay for experience. And the lesson she learned today, it was painfully clear. She replayed the laughter, the arrogance, and the absolute certainty in their eyes that humanity was, and always would be, beneath them. They were so wrong. She knew what her people could do when they were united. She had seen them go from riding horses to walking on their moon in the span of a single human life. She'd seen them survive world wars, pandemics, and natural disasters that should have wiped them off the map. She knew their greatest strength was a stubborn, deep-seated refusal to ever give up. The Council saw humanity's short history as a weakness. They saw their conflicts and called them primitive. They saw their need for sleep and their brief lifespans and called them pathetic. They just didn't get it. Humans weren't weak, they were incredibly resilient. They weren't primitive, they were masters of adaptation, and they weren't pathetic, they were patient, unbelievably patient. A new plan began to take shape in her mind. She would go home and tell everyone exactly what happened. She would describe the mockery, the condescension, the absolute dismissal. And then she would propose a new path forward. So the Council wanted humanity to grow up in peaceful isolation? Great. We would do just that, but it wasn't going to be the way they pictured it. Humanity was going to get bigger. We were going to get stronger. We would build a civilization that didn't need anyone's damn permission to exist. And someday, when the Council finally pulled their heads out of the sand and realized the colossal mistake they'd made, we'd be waiting. They would definitely remember this day. They would remember how they laughed. Staring out into the endless black of space, Elena Vasquez finally allowed herself a small, cold smile. The Council had absolutely no clue what they had just set in motion. Meanwhile, back in the Grand Chamber, hours after the session had ended, High Arbiter Zilvex sat all by himself. The massive Council chamber was silent at last, and the cavernous quiet was a relief. Zilvex knew he ought to be getting some rest before the next day's endless stream of complaints and arguments, but his mind kept wandering back to the human. It was absurd. She was just a single ambassador from some unimportant back-of-beyond planet. A total nobody. Her entire species was probably doomed to burn out in a couple of generations anyway, a pretty common end for so many of these upstart races. Still, he couldn't get the image of her leaving out of his head, the way she walked away with such quiet, unbreakable pride. In his 300 years serving on the Council, Zilvex was sure he had seen everything. He'd seen spectacular fits of rage and heartbreaking displays of sorrow, noble dignity, and absolute fury. But he had never, not even once, seen a petitioner just turn their back on the Council and leave without saying a word. In that last moment, he caught an expression in the human's eyes he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't defeat. It was something far more unnerving. It almost looked like patience. Zilvex made a sharp clicking sound with his mandibles, trying to brush the thought away. It meant nothing. The human meant nothing. In 1,000 years, no one would even remember this day. He pushed his ancient body out of his chair and left the chamber, determined to forget the whole silly incident. But deep inside his old mind, a tiny, nagging alarm had just started to ring, a warning whose real meaning he wouldn't understand for a very, very long time. For the first year after that strange meeting, nothing changed at all. Humanity had never been a big deal on the galactic scene. They operated a few trading posts in the outer systems, took part in a couple of minor scientific projects, and sometimes sent delegates to big meetings where they pretty much just faded into the wallpaper. And then, one day, they were just gone. Human cargo ships stopped showing up on the docking logs of Council-run stations. The chairs reserved for their delegates at interstellar meetings sat glaringly empty. The handful of human exchange students at off-world universities quietly packed their things and went home, not even bothering to say goodbye. And honestly, nobody really noticed. If the galaxy was the big leagues, humanity was a minor league team that had just gone under. Their absence was barely a footnote. Back on Earth, though, that footnote was a seismic event. The second ambassador, Elena Vasquez's ship, landed. She called an emergency summit with the entire leadership of the United Earth Confederacy. She stood before them, her face like a mask of cold steel, and told them exactly what went down. She didn't spare them a single detail, not one patronizing laugh, not one dismissive smirk. The recording of that summit was broadcast on every screen on the planet. Billions of people watched as the representatives from 412 alien species openly laughed at their official request to be recognized by the galactic community. They saw their own ambassador rip the translator from her ear, the biggest diplomatic slap in the face possible, and march out of the chamber, leaving stunned silence behind her. And then, Elena Vasquez laid out her plan. "They expect us to just disappear," she said. "They're banking on us either starting a civil war or spending the next 1,000 years begging to be let back in. They look at us like we're toddlers who, after a good cry, will come crawling back for scraps from their table." Her eyes, once known for their diplomatic warmth, were now like chips of flint. They have made a massive error in judgment. The plan she laid out was breathtakingly simple in its idea, but impossibly huge in its scale. Humanity would go dark. They would cut every single tie with the galactic community. No more trade agreements, no more showing up to pointless diplomatic parties, and definitely no more asking for anything from species that thought they were a joke. From this day on, humanity would look inward. Every last resource, every ounce of creativity would be focused on one single objective: getting ahead. They would advance their technology by any means they could. They would push into new systems, build up their defenses, and create a civilization so strong and self-reliant that it would never again have to ask anyone for permission just to exist. And the number one rule of the whole plan? They would do all of it in absolute, total, and deafening silence. "They laughed at us for measuring time by the spin of our tiny planet," Elena said, a chilling smile touching her lips. "Let's see how they feel after we ignore them for a few dozen spins of their own." The plan was approved without a single dissenting vote. The United Earth Confederacy sent out one final, galaxy-wide transmission. It was brief, professional, and radiated an icy politeness. The United Earth Confederacy would like to thank its galactic partners for their cooperation over the last several decades. Due to a period of major internal reorganization, we will be temporarily pausing all external diplomatic and commercial activities. We wish all species continued peace and prosperity. And that was all. No rage, no pointing fingers, no melodrama, just quiet. It was about 2 years later that the rest of the galaxy started to feel the first little itch of curiosity. The first clue that something was off came when Delegate Minara from the Hegemony of 12 Stars was looking over a trade summary. For generations, the Hegemony had a small but incredibly profitable deal with human farming colonies. It turned out humans had an almost magical touch for making plants thrive in the most worthless, rocky soil. Their farming methods had single-handedly rescued several of the hegemony's dying agricultural worlds from complete failure. Now, those same worlds were starting to fail all over again. "Did anyone ever get back to the humans about renewing the agricultural exchange treaty?" Minara asked his team. "We've sent 12 official requests over the past 8 months, sir," his assistant answered, nervously tapping his data slate. "All we ever receive is an automated message confirming delivery." "And that's it? For the love of the stars, what is that supposed to mean?" "It means, sir, that their system confirms they got our message. They're just choosing not to respond." Minara was completely thrown. This wasn't how you did business. You send an offer, they send a counteroffer, you haggle. You don't just ghost them. Around that same time, the Vorthani hive minds hit a similar wall. For decades, the Vorthani had quietly depended on human mathematicians to crack a very specific kind of theoretical problem. The Vorthani were brilliant in almost every area, but their massive collective intellect had some weird blind spots. Humans, with their messy individual brains, could see beautiful solutions that the Vorthani mind was literally unable to grasp. It was a minor arrangement, just a few ridiculously complex equations every couple of months. The humans seemed to like the puzzle, and the Vorthani paid them with bits of advanced technology. But now a backlog of unsolved equations was starting to grow. The Vorthani's deep space navigation system, which needed those solutions, started to get buggy. Starships began arriving days late. Whole supply chains were starting to unravel. What had begun as a tiny little problem was quickly turning into a massive logistical nightmare. "Get in touch with the humans," the Vorthani Council commanded. "Offer them whatever they want." The message was sent. The delivery confirmation was received. And then, silence. By year 5, the human problem had become a major topic of conversation in the council's hallways. "All right, seriously, has anyone actually managed to close a deal with the humans recently?" the Krelath delegate asked during a casual get-together. The question was answered with a room full of uncomfortable quiet and shuffling feet. "We offered them top-of-the-line technology transfers," Delegate Minara added. "We offered them amazing trade deals. We even offered to personally back their petition for readmission. They just plain don't answer. Maybe they finally had that atomic war they were always talking about and blew themselves up," someone mumbled from the back. It seemed like the most logical answer, but they were completely, utterly wrong. Long-range spy probes sent to the border of human-controlled territory told a shockingly different story. Earth wasn't just getting by, it was thriving. Their colonies were spreading at a dizzying rate, and their ships were darting all over their own systems, busier than a kicked anthill. They just weren't talking to anybody else. "This is ridiculous," the Vorthani delegate gurgled during a formal council meeting in year 8. "They're behaving like spoiled little grubs, hiding in a crack in the wall after being told no." High Arbiter Zilvex, the council's leader, slowly clicked his mandibles together as he thought. "They haven't broken any galactic laws," he pointed out, "and they haven't made any threats. It's like they've just decided we don't exist," one official complained. "Then let's force them to the table," another shot back. "And how do you propose we do that?" Zilvex countered. "The council has no authority to drag a sovereign race into talks they don't want. We could blockade their system." "Blockade what exactly? They have zero interstellar trade." "Then we'll threaten them with the Grand Armada." A glint of something that looked like pity flashed in Zilvex's complex eyes. "Against a species that hasn't so much as raised its voice in 8 years? The council would never approve such a baseless act of aggression, and frankly, what's the point? They're an insignificant species. Let them sulk in their little corner of the cosmos." But even as he said it, Zilvex felt a cold knot of fear tightening in his gut. There was something about the sheer, unwavering self-control of humanity's silence that was deeply, profoundly terrifying. And in the 10th year, a horror from the void arrived to prove him right. They were called the Thresh, a swarm that boiled out of the starless dark between galaxies. They'd show up every few thousand years and just consume everything in their path. You couldn't bargain with them. You couldn't intimidate them. They were a force of nature, a galactic plague. The council had fought them off before, but it was always a close call. The combined fleets of 400 species were always just barely enough to push them back into the void, but the price was always staggering. But this time was different. The Thresh had changed. They had evolved. Their old weapons, once clumsy and ineffective, now tore through the Galactic Council's most advanced shields like they were made of tissue paper. Their ships, once a manageable threat, now blotted out the stars in a horrifying tide. The first engagement was a massacre. 17 council fleets, the pride of 300 different worlds, were utterly annihilated in less than 24 hours. The handful of ships that managed to escape brought back a chilling report. None of their weapons could even scratch the enemy's hulls. The second engagement was a bloodbath. A frantic galaxy-wide emergency summit was called. The best military minds from every species gathered, working day and night, desperately hunting for a weakness, a new strategy, anything. They found nothing. The Thresh just kept advancing, devouring everything as they pushed deeper into council space. 3 capital worlds fell, and the inhabitants of those worlds weren't just conquered. They were erased from existence. Billions of lives were snuffed out in a matter of hours. "We have no moves left to make," the council's top general finally confessed, his voice thick with despair. "We need a new kind of weapon, a new strategy. We need a way to fight that we've never even imagined." That's when a quiet voice spoke up from the back of the chamber. "What about the humans?" Every head in the great hall swiveled in unison. "The humans," the diplomat said again, stepping forward. He was from some minor world nobody ever paid much attention to. Their entire recorded history is a catalog of warfare. They have a talent for destruction that, let's be honest, has always made the rest of us a bit squeamish. It's just possible they might see an angle that we are all too civilized, to find. A heavy, awkward silence blanketed the room. They all remembered the incident they privately called the Day of Laughter. They all remembered pointing and sneering at the pathetic little delegates from that tiny blue world. "They won't even respond to our hails," another official said with a shrug. "We've been trying to open a simple trade dialogue for years. Complete silence. This isn't about trade. Trillions of lives are hanging in the balance. You have to try again. Offer them the galaxy, a permanent seat on the High Council, full access to our tech archives, entire star systems, anything they could ever dream of. Just get them to pick up the phone." And so, the most desperate message in the history of the galaxy was composed and beamed toward Earth. It explained the terrifying reality of the Thresh. It was a groveling, humiliating plea for help. It offered humanity everything they had once been laughed out of the room for daring to ask for. A few minutes later, a reply came. 2 words: "Message received." And then, nothing but crushing silence as the Thresh fleets continued their fiery march across the stars. The galaxy was burning. 5 more worlds had been consumed, and the swarm was now vectoring directly toward the Council's capital station. For the first time in 11,000 years, the Galactic Council was staring down the barrel of its own extinction. In a final desperate gambit, the High Arbiter, Zilvex himself, decided to do the unthinkable. He was going to Earth alone. As his ship dropped into the human system, no alarms blared, no interceptors scrambled. A sleek, powerful human warship simply materialized out of the black, fell into perfect formation with him, and silently escorted him into the atmosphere. Zilvex had only ever seen the human homeworld on data screens. Now, he gazed down at the stunning, swirling marble of blue and white, at the glittering webs of city lights stretched across the continents, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't name. A smaller shuttle guided him to a breathtaking complex of minimalist, elegant structures overlooking a vast expanse of water the locals called the Pacific Ocean. He was greeted by guards in immaculate uniforms who led him without a word down pristine, silent hallways. They finally showed him into a large office where a woman sat at a wide desk, seemingly lost in her work. Time had touched Elena Vasquez. Her once dark hair was now threaded with silver, and the weight of leadership had etched fine lines around her eyes. She was no longer just some junior ambassador. She was the Secretary General of the United Earth Confederacy. The very same woman who had been laughed out of the council chamber all those years ago now looked up as Zilvex, the most powerful being in the known galaxy, walked into her office. Her eyes held no anger, no thirst for revenge. They held something far colder, a complete and total absence of feeling. "Hello, Arbiter," she said, her voice civil but as frigid as the void. "How can I help you?" Zilvex let it all spill out, the nightmare of the Thresh, the horrifying casualty reports, the desperate need for a fresh perspective before everything they had ever built was turned to dust. He spoke for nearly an hour, confessing everything. He admitted their arrogance, their foolishness, their abject terror, things no arbiter had ever admitted to an outsider. Through it all, Elena just sat, perfectly still, and listened. When he was finally finished, his voice raw, she gave a single, slow nod. "I see," she said. "That certainly sounds like a difficult situation." "It is," he pleaded, leaning forward. "Billions are dead. Billions more will follow if we don't stop them. We need your help." "I understand," was all she replied. The silence that followed was so dense it felt like it might crush him. Zilvex waited. He had come ready to bargain, to offer riches and power. He was not prepared for this absolute emptiness. "Secretary General," he said, his voice tight, "I am begging you. The entire Galactic Council is begging. Please, just tell us your price." Elena rose and walked to the vast window. The setting sun was painting the ocean with brilliant streaks of orange and crimson. She watched it for a long moment before she spoke. "Arbiter," she said, her voice suddenly soft. "Do you remember the Grand Chamber 15 years ago?" "I recall the session," he answered cautiously. "Your petition for membership was not approved." You laughed at me, she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. All 412 of you. You laughed so hard your own translation devices couldn't keep pace with the noise. And then you told me to come back and try again in 1,000 years. Secretary General, please, you can't let an old slight endanger the lives of trillions of innocents. It wasn't a slight, Elena corrected, turning to face him, her eyes still holding that terrifying void. It was a lesson. That day, you taught us the most valuable lesson we have ever learned. You showed us our precise place in this galaxy, and we took that lesson to heart. Perhaps we were hasty. We are prepared to reconsider your petition, full membership, with all rights and privileges effective immediately. Elena's smile was a thin, sharp line. High Arbiter, I'm about to say something, and I need you to understand that it is the 100% unvarnished truth. She took a deliberate step toward him. We don't want your membership. We don't want your technology. We don't want your star charts, and we certainly don't want your friendship. We want absolutely nothing from you. His 3 hearts pounded against his ribs. So you're just going to stand by and watch us die? Elena was quiet for a long, heavy moment. When we left that chamber, she finally said, we made a vow. We would never again depend on the kindness of anyone who could so easily dismiss us. We would never again ask for a seat at a table where we were not wanted. So we spent the last 15 years building our own table, one that has no need for yours. Building what? He asked, his voice shaking. That is no longer any of your concern. Elena returned to her desk and pressed a control. Your escort is waiting to return you to your ship. I wish you a safe trip back. Zilvex was stunned into silence. In 11,000 years, no one had ever simply said no to the council, not to a treaty, not to a trade deal, but to the very concept of a conversation. You can't be serious, he stammered. This is insanity. We're offering you everything you ever asked for. 15 years too late, she replied, picking up a datapad and focusing on it, dismissing the most powerful man in the galaxy as if he were a fly buzzing at the window. Goodbye, High Arbiter. And Zilvex was escorted off the planet, shrouded in a silence that was more deafening than any explosion. As his ship warped into faster than light, he glanced back at Earth, that tiny blue marble. It looked so peaceful, exactly like the official reports always described it. But he knew better now. Something deep down had shifted. The humans weren't begging for a spot in the Galactic Council anymore. A cold, chilling realization washed over Zilvex. They were done asking. And that was far more terrifying than any monster the Thresh could ever be. He returned to the council and delivered his report. The chamber erupted in outrage. How dare the humans say no? How could they put their ridiculous pride before the survival of the entire galaxy? It just proved what they'd suspected all along. Humans were selfish, primitive, and unworthy of a place among the stars. But all their screaming and grandstanding changed nothing. The humans stayed quiet, and the Thresh continued their brutal advance. In the end, the council survived, but just barely. It took another 3 savage years and cost them 17 entire species, erased from existence forever. 43 worlds were scorched into glass. Civilizations that had flourished for millennia were gone, as if they were never there. For 11,000 years, a grand alliance had maintained peace, but now it was a broken, humbled thing. And humanity? They did absolutely nothing. You'd see their ships flicker into existence at the edge of a battle like silent specters, never taking sides, but never interfering either. They would pull survivors from the wreckage, regardless of species, drop them at a safe harbor, and then simply vanish back into the void. They never fired a single weapon. They never asked for payment. But every soul they saved told the same unbelievable stories. The human ships were wrong. They moved in ways that defied physics. They could pop into being from nowhere and disappear in an instant. Their hulls seemed to shimmer as if they weren't fully in our dimension. At first, everyone dismissed these accounts as the ramblings of traumatized survivors. I mean, come on. Human technology was notoriously clunky and basic, but the stories kept piling up, and they were all eerily consistent. Sometime during those 15 years of silence, humanity had changed. No one knew how, no one knew why. But whatever they had become was about to send shockwaves through the entire galaxy. The catastrophic Thresh War finally sputtered out after 18 long years of human silence. The galaxy it left in its wake was a ghost of its former self. The Grand Chamber, which once held representatives from 412 species, now seated only 395. 17 civilizations had been completely annihilated. Their home worlds were now just monuments of dust and memory. Their people, nothing more than whispers. Entire histories were reduced to data files in the Council's archives. Another 43 planets had been rendered completely uninhabitable. The casualties numbered in the countless billions. Alliances that had lasted for ages shattered under the strain of war. Friendships that spanned generations were soured by distrust and blame. The Galactic Council still existed in name, but it was an empty shell. Its authority was a joke, its commands frequently ignored. Species that were once allies now viewed each other with suspicion. And through all of this galactic chaos, humanity remained completely silent. They didn't lift a finger to help in the war, but they never caused any trouble either. They just watched from the cosmic sidelines, rescuing who they could, but refusing to get involved. Their silence became the stuff of legend. Some branded them cowards. Others whispered that they were playing some kind of long game, that they possessed a hidden wisdom. But most just tried to put them out of their minds. The only problem was, that was becoming increasingly difficult. The stories from the war survivors weren't going away. In fact, they were becoming more detailed and even more bizarre. People described human ships that seemed to treat physics like a suggestion. They spoke of technology that was indistinguishable from magic, power readings that flew so far off the charts they fried the sensors, levels beyond anything the Council had ever recorded. A brilliant scientist, Chief Technician Aldara, was assigned to investigate. She was a being of pure energy, one of the most intelligent minds in the galaxy, who had dedicated 2 centuries to understanding the laws of the universe. What she discovered simply didn't compute. These readings indicate their ships operate on principles we can't even begin to comprehend, she reported to the Science Committee. It's less like they're flying and more like they're stepping around reality, and their energy signatures, we have absolutely nothing like them in our entire database. How is that possible? The committee chair demanded. 18 years ago, they were still fumbling with primitive chemical rockets. They were centuries behind us. I don't know how, Aldara pulsed in response. I only know what the data is telling me. Then your data is faulty. It must be sensor glitches from damaged ships. Aldara's energy form flared with frustration. I've cross-referenced over 300 separate incidents. The data is consistent across every single one. So either every survivor of the Thresh War experienced the exact same impossible glitch, or the humans now wield technology so advanced it's beyond our wildest imagination. The committee refused to listen. They classified her report as unreliable and buried it in the deepest digital archive they had. But you can't ignore the truth forever. About 2 years after the war, a rebellion erupted against the oppressive hegemony of 12 stars. This wasn't exactly shocking news. The hegemony was an empire built on crushing dissent, so uprisings were a regular occurrence for them. And they were always, without fail, brutally put down. This time, the spark ignited on a small world called Valen 4. Its people, the Cathari, were a peaceful species that had lived under the hegemony's boot for generations. They had endured centuries of quiet suffering, but the losses from the Galactic War were the final straw. They rose up and said, "No more." The hegemony responded exactly as predicted. They dispatched a fleet to turn the planet into rubble. 30 massive warships, armed with enough firepower to crack the world in two, dropped out of hyperspace over Valen 4. The Cathari had no military. Their only options were surrender or annihilation. But when the fleet arrived, they found someone was already there: human ships. On the bridge of her flagship, Commander Thera couldn't believe her eyes. 3 small human ships were just hanging in orbit above Valen 4, positioned directly between her colossal fleet and the planet. On paper, they were barely a nuisance, But every combat instinct Thera had honed over the years was screaming at her that this was a terrible mistake. Then, a calm voice broke the silence on an open channel. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the UEC Endeavour." The human captain claimed they were neutral observers, present only to protect civilians. But Commander Thera had fought in 100 vicious campaigns. She wasn't about to be intimidated by 3 tiny human vessels. She didn't see a rescue operation. She saw a direct challenge to her authority. "Human vessel," she broadcast, her voice dripping with disdain. "You are trespassing in hegemony space during a military action. Depart immediately, or we will open fire." The human's reply was infuriatingly calm. "Negative, Commander. We are not going anywhere." For a moment, Thera actually paused. The Council had issued quiet warnings to be cautious around humans since they went off the grid. "Don't poke the sleeping bear," the diplomats used to say. But this was her space, her mission. Thera had her orders and, more importantly, her pride. "All ships," she commanded, a cruel smile forming on her lips. "Target the human vessels. Fire at will." 30 warships unleashed a storm of pure destruction. Lances of plasma, clouds of antimatter missiles, and devastating gravity waves, enough force to obliterate a moon, all converged on the 3 small ships. And then the impossible happened. Everything just stopped. The entire tempest of death froze in midair, like a snapshot of an explosion. Every missile, every bolt of energy just hung there for a heartbeat. And then it all reversed course. The hegemony's own weapons were now streaking back towards them, perfectly retracing their paths. In 13 seconds, 30 warships went dead. They weren't destroyed. They were just turned off. As the faint emergency lights flickered on, Thera was shocked to feel a wave of relief. Her crew was alive. Their weapons were inert, their engines were cold, their shields were gone, but the ships themselves were completely unharmed. They were utterly helpless. Right on cue, shuttles began emerging from the 3 human ships. They descended to Vallon 4 and began evacuating the Cathari civilians. Thousands of people who had been moments from death were now being gently guided onto transport ships and carried away to safety. The mighty hegemony fleet, 30 of the most dreaded ships in the quadrant, could only drift there, completely powerless, and watch it all unfold. Hours later, once the last evacuee was aboard, a final message arrived from the humans. The United Earth Confederacy has no desire for a war with the hegemony of 12 stars. However, we will not stand by while innocent lives are threatened. We suggest you find a more peaceful resolution to your internal affairs. The message was signed, Captain Sarah Chen, UEC Endeavour. And with that, the human ships were gone. They didn't jump to light speed. They didn't accelerate away. They just vanished from existence, as if they had never been there in the first place. Commander Thera sat on her dark, silent bridge, struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Her entire fleet neutralized in seconds. Not a single casualty, not a scratch on any hull, yet every offensive and defensive system had been surgically disabled. It would take weeks to get them operational again. By then, the Cathari would be long gone, and the humans had done it all with just 3 small ships. Imagine being so thoroughly humiliated in front of the entire galaxy that your only choice is to disappear. Now, what would you do with that time? Would you plot revenge? Or would you do something so incredible it would make everyone who wronged you completely irrelevant? Stick around to find out what humanity chose, because the news of what happened at Vallon 4 just hit the Galactic Council like a tidal wave. They scrambled to call an emergency meeting. The Grand Chamber, which once held representatives from 412 species, was now down to 395. But the fear in that room was so thick you could almost taste it. "That was an act of war," boomed Delegate Minara of the Hegemony. "They attacked a hegemony fleet for no reason." "That's not what happened. They defended themselves after your fleet fired first," High Arbiter Zilvex shot back, his voice as cold as deep space as his complex eyes blinked one after the other. "And they managed it without a single casualty on either side." That's not the point. They possess some kind of technology that can do that. Manara was waving his arms in a panic. They stopped our weapons in mid-air. They literally turned our missiles around on us. They neutralized 30 of our best warships in a heartbeat. How is that even possible? From the back of the chamber, a quiet voice mumbled, "Maybe we should have listened to Chief Technician Aldara." A sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. Every single one of them remembered her report, the one they had all dismissed as science fiction. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Zilvex announced, his voice cutting through the quiet. "We need to find out what humanity has been building in secret and how they've done it." And just like that, the Council kicked off the single largest intelligence operation in its entire history. Spy drones tiptoed along the edges of human-controlled space, while undercover agents from a dozen worlds were dispatched to dig up any clue they could find. Every scrap of information on human activity over the past 20 years was put under a microscope. What they discovered didn't just shock them, it completely shattered their understanding of the universe. The humans hadn't been hiding and licking their wounds, they had been busy. They were using scientific principles that the Council's greatest minds couldn't even begin to wrap their heads around. Humanity had somehow jumped thousands of years ahead of everyone else. They had completely changed the rules of the game. One day, humans were still using clunky old fusion drives, and the next, their ships were just materializing in star systems out of thin air. Their power sources seemed to completely ignore the known laws of physics. They could create advanced materials thousands of times faster than before, and their military strength made the combined navies of the entire Galactic Council look like a bunch of bathtub toys. We think they're manipulating other dimensions, the lead intelligence analyst reported, her voice shaking. Their starships don't seem to exist entirely in our reality. It's like they can just sidestep physics, and their weapons. We don't even have the vocabulary for the science they're using. "How?" Manara screamed. "How did this happen? They were just a primitive backwater species." The delegate from Vorthan, a creature made of shimmering energy, seemed to pulse with what could only be described as admiration. "They are human," it said, its voice echoing softly. "When you back them into a corner, they don't just lash out, they evolve. When you tell them something is impossible, they take it as a personal challenge. We gave them the greatest gift we ever could have." "And what gift was that?" another delegate asked, confused. "We gave them a reason to prove every single one of us wrong." But the analyst wasn't finished, and the news was about to get a whole lot worse. It wasn't just about their mind-bending technology. Humanity itself had grown. What had been a handful of small colonies orbiting a single star had blossomed into a massive network spanning dozens of worlds. The human population had exploded from 8 billion to nearly 40 billion in just 2 decades. And as it turned out, they hadn't been doing it alone. While the Council was caught up in its endless political games and petty wars, humanity had been quietly building friendships with species the Council had written off. Smaller civilizations they'd labeled as too primitive or insignificant to bother with. These were the very same worlds that had been denied a seat on the Council for the same reasons humanity had been kicked out. The humans had offered them a partnership, an alliance founded on mutual respect, not the Council's rigid top-down power structure. "Our intel shows that at least 37 species have entered into formal alliances with humanity," the analyst continued. "Many have been given incredible technological advancements. Several of them are now becoming major powers in their own right." "They're building their own council," Zilvex whispered, his gaze lost in the distance. "It certainly looks that way." The chamber descended into absolute chaos. Delegates started screaming at each other, pointing appendages, and throwing around accusations. Some demanded an immediate all-out war against the humans. Others begged for diplomacy. A few even suggested they should surrender now and save themselves the trouble. Zilvex let the madness continue for a few moments before slamming his gavel. "We have a problem," he said, his voice slicing through the noise. "A very, very big problem. Humanity is now a galactic superpower, and we are completely unprepared." "We have to strike before they strike us," Manara shrieked. "With what, you fool?" another delegate snapped back. "Did you not hear a word she said? 3 of their ships just humiliated 30 of our most advanced warships without breaking a sweat. Our best military minds are estimating that if humanity actually wanted to, they could annihilate our combined fleets in under 24 hours. Then we must negotiate, offer them whatever they want. We already tried that, Zilvex said with a long, tired sigh. They've told us they don't want anything from us. Then what are we supposed to do? For a long, tense moment, Zilvex was silent. We're going to ask them for a meeting, he finally said, politely. We will assemble a formal diplomatic team, the High Arbiter declared. We will send a request for a parley, and we will finally afford them the respect we should have shown them 20 years ago. Zilvex's assistant nervously clicked his mandibles. And what if they refuse? Then, Zilvex replied with a dark expression, we had better pray that they decide to keep being as patient and merciful as they've been so far. And with that, a diplomatic mission was put together with a sense of urgency that bordered on pure panic. They broadcast their message into the silent darkness of space. Days bled into weeks. The Council, the supposed rulers of the known galaxy, were reduced to pacing their halls, anxiously waiting for a reply. At last, after 2 months that felt like 2 centuries, an answer arrived. It was incredibly short. The United Earth Confederacy acknowledged their request. A meeting would be granted. The time and place were to be determined. You would have thought they'd just won a major war. The council chamber erupted with cheers of pure relief. They were going to talk. The humans were willing to sit down and talk. But a few of the older, sharper delegates saw what everyone else had missed. The humans hadn't listed a single demand. There were no conditions, no ultimatums, no angry threats. They just agreed. And there was something about that calm, simple acceptance that was far more unsettling than any threat they could have made. The humans didn't sound angry, or scared, or even all that interested. They just sounded willing to listen. And that, more than anything else, was the most terrifying thing of all. The meeting was scheduled to be held at a station called Haven's Rest. It was a place that didn't even exist on star charts a decade ago, but was now one of the biggest structures in the galaxy. It sat right on the border of human territory, a gleaming, massive city in space, filled with docks, apartments, and grand halls built to welcome thousands of different life forms. It was a neutral zone, not controlled by the Council or by humanity. It had become a central hub for everyone else. The Council's delegation arrived with a fleet of their 50 most powerful ships, meant to be a symbol of the combined might of 395 species. It was supposed to be a little show of force, a reminder that they still mattered. But as their warships neared Haven's Rest, that feeling of confidence began to melt away. The station was a beehive of activity. Ships of every shape and size imaginable were in a constant flow of arrivals and departures. The station's corridors were a living, breathing tapestry of beings from dozens upon dozens of worlds. Their spies quickly confirmed that at least 70 different civilizations were now actively trading there, and not a single one was a member of their council. High Arbiter Zilvex led his delegation through the station's crowded walkways. He tried to project an air of dignity, but his huge compound eyes couldn't stop darting around, taking in every stunning detail. Human security officers watched them pass, their faces polite but unreadable, professional but completely devoid of warmth. They gave short, direct answers to questions and led the group to the conference room with an efficiency that felt almost dismissive. The room itself, however, was perfect. The chairs had been custom-made to fit the unique anatomy of each delegate, and drinks and snacks appropriate for each species' biology were already waiting. Every diplomatic detail had been flawlessly handled. The humans were already there, waiting for them. And at the head of the table sat Secretary General Elena Vasquez. She was an old woman now, her hair a brilliant white and her face etched with the lines of time. But her eyes were exactly the same as they had been 23 years ago, when she was laughed out of their grand chamber, calm, unreadable, and filled with an ocean of patience. To her right stood Admiral James Okonkwo, the top commander of Earth's entire military, a solidly built man whose expression gave nothing away. On her left was Dr. Leo Wei, humanity's head scientist, A petite woman who seemed to buzz with a silent energy, like she was working on cosmic puzzles none of them could even begin to grasp. And behind them, a quiet formation of human officers and diplomats stood like a solid wall. Every last one of them watched the council delegates enter the room with the same calm, unreadable look on their faces. Zilvex found his assigned chair. As soon as the chamber fell silent, he cleared his throat. "Secretary General Vasquez," he began, "thank you for granting us this audience." Elena gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. "You're the ones who requested it, High Arbiter. We're here to listen." Zilvex had gone over this moment in his head for weeks. He had speeches memorized, arguments prepared, and incredibly generous deals polished and ready to go. But as he looked into Elena's unwavering eyes, he tossed the entire script. "We were wrong," he said, the words cutting through the tense atmosphere. A wave of shock washed over the assembly. Even his own advisors, who were ready for a clever political maneuver, just stared at him with their mouths open. 23 years ago, Zilvex continued, your people approached us. You asked for a seat on our council. You pleaded your case with a dignity and hope that was truly something special. You weren't asking for a handout, just a real opportunity to prove you belonged. He paused, his mandibles clicking softly. And we laughed at you. All 412 species, we all laughed together. We called you too young, too primitive, too chaotic. We took every single thing you had accomplished and made it seem small. He spread his arms wide in a gesture of complete surrender. We were arrogant, and we were absolute fools. Elena simply watched him, her face a blank slate. In the years after that, Zilvex went on, his voice filled with urgency, we kept tabs on you. Your technology now blows ours out of the water in almost every area. Your network of allies includes races we ignored for centuries, and your victory at Valenfor showed a military power that we have no hope of matching. He bowed his head, a sign of submission that no High Arbiter had ever made to an outsider. The Galactic Council is formally inviting humanity to join as a full and equal member with all the rights and privileges that come with it. We are offering trade agreements, joint scientific projects, and mutual defense treaties. Everything we so cruelly denied you 23 years ago, we're now giving you freely. It's all yours, no strings attached. He raised his head, his eyes locking with Elena's. We are begging you, Secretary General, please say yes. A heavy silence fell over the room once more. Every person in the chamber held their breath, waiting for humanity's response. Elena held Zilvex's gaze for a long, tense moment. Then she glanced at Admiral Okonkwo and Dr. Wei. The three humans just looked at each other. Not a single word was exchanged, but in that split-second look, a deep and complex understanding seemed to pass between them. At last, Elena turned her gaze back to the council. 23 years ago, she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to reach every corner of the great hall. I stood in this very chamber and respectfully asked for a seat among you. I was speaking for a young species, one that was full of optimism and ready to learn. All we wanted was to be part of something bigger than ourselves, to help, to belong. She leaned forward just a bit. And you laughed. That sound went on for nearly 10 minutes, 412 species, all telling us in one voice that we were nothing. And when the laughter finally stopped, you told us to come back in 1,000 years, assuming we hadn't destroyed ourselves by then. Zilvex's multiple eyes blinked in rapid succession. Secretary General, we realize now that we made a terrible mistake. Elena's voice was as calm as ice. Oh, you do. You figured that out 23 years too late. You figured it out when we built technology that scares you, when we made an alliance you can't push around, and when we proved we could take apart your fleets without even trying. Yes. Now, you see your mistake. She leaned back in her chair, the perfect picture of calm control. The day we walked out of this chamber feeling completely humiliated, we made a promise to ourselves. We would never again depend on anyone who could throw us away so easily. We would never again beg for a seat at a table where the hosts only respected power and fear. But Secretary General, our offer is genuine. We really want you as our partners. I have no doubt you do, now that you need our help. But answer me this. What happens when our tech development slows down? What if our alliance hits a rough patch? What happens when we're not so scary anymore? Elena shook her head slowly. Would you still see us as equals then? Or would we just go back to being your cute little primitives? Zilvex was speechless. He couldn't think of a single thing to say. High Arbiter, Elena said. I'm about to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I mean it with every part of my soul. She rose to her feet, and every human at the table stood with her in perfect unison. In the isolation you forced on us, we built something new. And I don't just mean better ships or stronger shields. We built a society that judges others on their character, not on how old their species is. We built a family where you're valued for who you are, not for how long you've been flying between the stars. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on each of the council delegates. We went looking for the species you ignored, the young civilizations you decided were worthless, the different cultures you couldn't be bothered with. We offered them a partnership, not a spot in a hierarchy. We offered them teamwork, not control. We showed them respect before they had to build an army to demand it. Her gaze finally returned to Zilvex. That is the fundamental difference between us, High Arbiter. You waited until we were strong to offer us your respect. We believe every living creature deserves dignity from the very start. Zilvex felt a cold pit of dread forming in his stomach. So, you're turning down our offer. We aren't turning it down, she corrected him gently. We just don't have a need for it. Elena gathered her papers. The Human Alliance already has 73 member species. In the next year, that number will likely be over 100. We already have everything we asked you for 23 years ago. A community, partners, a place where we fit in. We just built it on our own, with friends who saw our value when we had nothing to give but ourselves. Then why did you agree to this meeting? Zilvex asked, his voice strained. Elena stopped at the doorway. For the very first time, a hint of what might have been sympathy softened her eyes. Because we are not you, she said quietly. We're not going to laugh in your face. We won't make fun of you when you stumble or enjoy your problems. We remember how that feels far too well. She turned to speak to the entire council. The Galactic Council is welcome to send observers to any alliance meeting. Individual species from your council can apply for membership in our alliance, but they will be judged by the exact same standards as anyone else. And if you ever face a threat like the Thresh again, we will step in to save innocent lives, no matter their political affiliation. But you won't join us. No, she said simply. We will not. Elena's expression was kind but absolutely firm. You told us to go off and grow up in peaceful isolation. Well, you got your wish. We grew up, we found peace, and we're perfectly happy with our isolation from you. She turned and walked out of the chamber, the other humans following her in dead silence. Zilvex was paralyzed in his seat. All around him, the combined diplomatic power of 395 species sat in stunned, absolute silence. They had offered humanity the keys to the entire galaxy, full membership, exclusive trade routes, a military alliance, a heartfelt apology for their past cruelty, and humanity had just politely said, "No thank you," and left. Again. The long flight back to the council's capital was disturbingly quiet. The delegates hardly spoke a word. What was there left to say? They had misjudged the situation on a level they couldn't even start to understand. It wasn't because of a war or a failed treaty, but because of a far more crushing reality. Humanity simply didn't need them anymore. For 11,000 years, the Galactic Council had been the undisputed center of the known universe. Every civilization that mattered was either a member or was desperate to join. The Council's acceptance was the biggest prize you could win. Its rejection was a sentence to be forgotten by history. And now, all of a sudden, there was another option. A rapidly expanding alliance built on principles the Council had never even considered. A community that didn't give a damn how old your species was, how advanced your tech was, or what you happened to look like. And humanity, the very species they had laughed right out of their chamber, was the heart and soul of it all. Zilvex thought about Elena Vasquez the whole way home, about the hopeful young diplomat who had asked for nothing more than a chance, and the powerful leader she had become, a leader who now held the fate of the galaxy in her hands. Her eyes weren't filled with anger, just this cold, unbreakable certainty. The council had brought this on themselves. They took a species full of hope and taught them a brutal lesson on how the galaxy truly operated. They showed humanity exactly how much respect they could expect from the old guard, and boy, did humanity learn that lesson well. They learned that respect is never handed to you. It has to be earned, usually through sheer strength. They learned that the powerful will always look down on the weak. They learned that a long history and shiny gadgets meant more than good character and raw potential. And after taking all of that in, humanity just decided to build something completely different. That's what stung the most, Zilvex finally understood. It wasn't that humanity's technology had blown past their own. It wasn't that they'd become a rival. It was that they had taken the Council's bitter lessons and tossed them straight into a star. The Council taught humanity that the strong get to laugh at the weak. So, humanity decided to get strong, and then chose to be kind anyway. And now, 23 years too late, the Council was finally getting a taste of its own medicine. When the delegation stumbled back to the Council station, they walked into the Grand Chamber to find pure, unadulterated chaos. Word of the disastrous meeting had somehow already gotten out. Different species were yelling at each other. Fingers and other appendages were being pointed. Some blamed Zilvex for the diplomatic catastrophe. Others blamed the species who had laughed the loudest 23 years ago. A small, quiet faction blamed the entire council system itself. Zilvex just watched the pandemonium with a tired, weary feeling. Let them yell, let them play the blame game. It wouldn't make a single bit of difference. Humanity had built something from the ground up, something that didn't need the council's blessing, something that was growing bigger by the day while the council was slowly shriveling up. And there was absolutely nothing any of them could do to stop it. The Galactic Council's time was over. A new age was dawning, and humanity, the very species they had brushed off as nobodies, was about to become the center of it all. Zilvex looked up at the massive crystal-laced ceiling of the Grand Chamber. 11,000 years of history. 11,000 years of being absolutely sure they were the heart of the civilized universe. All of it was turning to dust because 23 years ago they picked on the wrong species. And now it was way, way too late to say sorry. 50 years had passed since the day the galaxy pointed and laughed at Earth. Now, that day is a galactic holiday. Every single year, on the anniversary, humans and their allies take a moment to remember the day that changed their destiny forever. It's a story you hear in every school. Museums have entire wings dedicated to it, and the grandparents who were just kids when they saw it happen live on screen now tell the story to their own grandkids. The galaxy had been changed in ways no one could have ever predicted. And the old Galactic Council? Well, technically, it was still around. The giant crystal towers of the station still sparkled under their fake sun. The delegates still gathered in the Grand Chamber to bicker and vote. But these days, that stunning chamber was more than half empty. Species didn't leave in a big rush, but more like a slow, steady trickle over the decades. Some officially signed on with the human concordat. Others just vanished into the background, seeing no reason to stick around. A few just fell apart completely, unable to keep up with the new way of things. High Arbiter Zilvex was still in charge. He was an old man now, even for his long-living people. His outer shell had lost its shine, and he moved slowly and deliberately. But his compound eyes were as sharp and wise as ever, and his mind was still a steel trap. He now presided over a council of only 112 species. That's less than a third of what it was in its prime. And today's meeting was especially humiliating. The motion to ask the human concordat for observer status is now on the floor, Zilvex announced, his voice echoing in the mostly empty hall. This was the council's 5th time asking. The first 4 times, their requests were politely received, and then met with total silence. Not a no, not a yes, just nothing. It was a clever political move humanity had learned from watching them. The vote passed with everyone in favor. Of course it did. What other choice did they have? The Concordat was now made up of over 200 member species. Its economy made the councils look like a joke. Its tech was generations ahead of theirs. and its core beliefs of fairness and helping each other out were like a magnet for new members. The council was basically becoming a historical artifact, and every single person in that room knew it. After the session was over, Zilvex wandered the station's halls all by himself. He did that a lot lately, just walking and thinking. He remembered the Grand Chamber in its glory days, packed to the rafters with delegates from 412 different species. He remembered the rock-solid belief they all had, the feeling that they were the absolute center of the universe. He remembered laughing at a young human woman who dared to ask for a seat at their table. He wondered, like he had so many times before, what might have happened if they'd just said yes. If they had welcomed humanity, shown them the ropes, and given them a fair shot to prove themselves. Would things be different now? Probably, almost certainly. But that's not what they did. They laughed. And now, every last one of them was paying the price. All the way on the other side of the galaxy, on a station named Concordat Prime, a very different kind of meeting was about to start. The Human Concordat's annual gathering brought together representatives from 217 species. They came from every corner of space, brand new civilizations and ancient empires, giant creatures and tiny ones, beings made of flesh, energy, silicon, and stuff that was almost beyond description. This meeting wasn't held in some massive, intimidating chamber designed to make you feel small. It took place in a simple hall, built for comfort and actual conversation. There were no high and mighty platforms for the important species, no seating chart that ranked everyone by their power or age. In this room, every single delegate was an equal, all sitting on the same level. From the doorway, Admiral Sarah Chen watched them all come in. The years had turned her hair white, and her shoulders were a bit stooped from a long life of service, but she still stood proud. Her eyes, though, hadn't lost a bit of their fire. She had seen it all. Terrible wars and delicate peace, heart-wrenching tragedies and unbelievable triumphs, and she had watched a new galactic power rise from the ashes of the old. And she never forgot how it all began. A young Vorthani delegate named Trinex, the first of his kind born free from the Council's shadow, walked up to her. His parents had been pioneers, some of the very first to leave the ancient council that had ruled their people for ages to join this new Concordat. "Admiral Chen," he said, his gelatinous body shaking with genuine admiration. "Wow, it's a real honor to meet you." Sarah gave him a warm smile. "The honor is all mine, Delegate. The work you've done on the Integration Committee has been nothing short of amazing." The compliment made Trinex practically glow with pride. "I learned from the best. My human education taught me that every voice matters. My parents weren't raised to believe that." "Well, things have changed," Sarah said gently. "Yes, they have, thanks to your people," Trinex replied. Then he hesitated. "Admiral, if it's not too much trouble, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Is the story true, the one they call the Day of Laughter? Did the Council really humiliate humanity that badly?" Sarah's smile tightened just a little. "It's true. I wasn't there myself, but I watched the broadcast. Eventually, everyone in the galaxy saw it. It just seems so crazy. How could they have been so arrogant?" Sarah's gaze drifted across the hall, filled with beings the Council had once looked down on. Every single one of them was now in this room, working together as equals. They weren't blind, she finally answered. They were just certain. For 11,000 years, they were the center of the universe. They just couldn't picture a world where they weren't. "And then you showed them they were wrong," Trinex said. "Not just me," Sarah corrected him softly, gesturing at the bustling room. "All of us. It was everyone who decided that being strong doesn't give you a license to be cruel. Everyone who chose to build something better, instead of just tearing down what was already there." Trinex was silent for a moment. "So what happens with the Council? I heard they sent another request for observer status." "That's right." "Are you going to say yes this time?" It was a question Sarah had heard 1,000 times. The Council had been sending those petitions for years. And every time, the Concordat leadership would talk it over and decide the time still wasn't right. It was never about revenge or being petty. It was because, in the Concordat, being an observer was a huge deal. It meant a species was truly ready to listen, to change, and to accept a whole new way of being part of the galaxy. Imagine spending your whole career being told you're not good enough, only for the ones who mocked you to come begging for a seat at your table. That was the impossible choice facing Sarah. "I can't make that call alone," she said, her voice steady. "This goes to the entire assembly for a vote." Her friend Trinex pushed, "But what will your vote be?" Sarah went quiet, lost in a flood of memories. All those years of being dismissed, the horror of the Valen 4 incident, the endless, meaningless meetings, and the hollow apologies that always came a generation too late. She thought of Elena Vasquez, who had passed on a decade ago, a legend celebrated by over 100 different species. Elena was the one who stormed out of that old council chamber with her chin up and then dedicated her life to building something better than the broken system that had rejected her. What would Elena do? The answer hit her like a bolt of lightning. "I'd vote yes," Sarah said finally. "Not because they've earned it, but because of what it proves about us. We're going to offer a hand to everyone, even the ones who used to kick us when we were down." Trinex's shimmering form flickered with shock. "Are you serious? After everything they did to us?" "That's precisely why," Sarah replied, turning to look him straight in the eye. "The Council's entire world view was that the powerful get to crush the weak. We chose to build something different. The second we start punishing people for failing to meet our standards, we become just like them." She looked out at this massive assembly hall, where delegates from 217 different species were finding their seats. "Besides," she added, her tone softening, "they've been punished plenty. They had to sit on the sidelines and watch their entire empire crumble while we thrived. For a people as proud as them, that stings more than anything we could ever do to them." The session kicked off a few minutes later, with hundreds of representatives working out trade deals, joint scientific ventures, and mutual defense agreements. Big decisions weren't passed by a simple majority. They required a unanimous vote. Every disagreement was talked through until a solution was found, not settled by showing off who had the bigger fleet. Toward the end of the day, the old council's request for observer status was brought to the floor. The debate was surprisingly brief. A few delegates spoke against it. Some wounds were still too fresh, but almost everyone shared the view Sarah had expressed to Trinex. They had built their Concordat on the ideals of inclusion and respect. To slam the door on a group asking to learn from them would betray the very foundation of their society. The right thing to do was obvious. They would grant them observer status. The council would be invited in, not as fallen galactic tyrants, but as students, as beginners, as a people who, if they could just swallow their pride, might find a new home in this better version of the galaxy. This was never about revenge. This had nothing to do with retribution. It was simply about the Concordat being true to itself and choosing to be the bigger person. On the Council's command station, High Arbiter Zilvex got the notification. He had to read the message 3 times, convinced it was some kind of mistake. They had actually approved it. After all the begging, after years of being completely ignored, the same way his council had once ignored them, humanity had finally said yes. A strange cocktail of emotions hit Zilvex all at once. First came a tidal wave of relief. This was the lifeline his people desperately needed to survive. But immediately after, a heavy, sinking feeling washed over him, one he could only identify as pure shame. They were being given another chance, not because they had earned it, but because the Concordat was simply choosing to be kind. The Council had once written off humanity as too simple, too weak, too alien. And now the Concordat was welcoming the Council, despite its long and bloody history of cruelty. It was a complete reversal of everything the Council had ever stood for. And that one simple act of grace somehow made Zilvex feel 100 times smaller than an outright rejection ever could have.